In 2018, Venezuela experienced 1,698,488% inflation in a single year, making the bolivar one of the most worthless currencies in human history. And this wasn't caused by war or natural disaster. This was caused by President Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan central bank printing unlimited money to finance government spending. And the result was that a currency that in 2008 could buy groceries became, in 2018, literally worthless. People carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, used bolivar notes as napkins because they were cheaper than paper, and entire life savings were destroyed overnight. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Venezuela's government printed 1,000,000% inflation, why hyperinflation always follows the same pattern of government money printing, no matter which country or political system, how the bolivar went from being a functioning currency to worthless paper in just 5 years, and why this collapse is a warning for every country, including the United States, that prints money to finance deficits. Because once you understand that Venezuela's hyperinflation wasn't caused by socialism or capitalism or sanctions, but by the simple economic law that printing unlimited money destroys currency value, you'll understand why the US Federal Reserve's $9 trillion in money printing since 2008 is following the exact same path as Venezuela, just at a slower speed, while your dollar has lost 98% of its value since 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window and allowed unlimited printing, why inflation is permanent in every country that abandons sound money, and why holding cash in any fiat currency is guaranteed to make you poorer over time, while governments and banks who create money get richer at your expense. Before we explain how Venezuela printed 1,000,000% inflation, we need to understand what Venezuela's economy looked like before the collapse and why the government started printing money, because this reveals that hyperinflation isn't caused by external factors, but by governments choosing to print rather than make hard fiscal choices. In 2008, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. It has the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, and when oil prices were high from 2004 to 2014, averaging over $90 per barrel, Venezuela's government had massive oil revenue, approximately $100 billion per year, flowing into government coffers, and President Hugo Chavez, who ruled from 1999 to 2013, used this oil money to fund extensive social programs, subsidized food, free healthcare, free education, government jobs, and these programs were popular and kept Chavez in power, but they were only sustainable when oil prices remained high, and the programs created a fiscal structure where government spending was far higher than tax revenue, meaning the government depended on oil money to cover the difference. When Chavez died in March 2013 and Nicolás Maduro took over, the system was already fragile. Government spending was approximately $120 billion per year, but non-oil tax revenue was only about $30 billion, meaning Venezuela needed $90 billion in oil revenue just to break even, and this worked until 2014, when oil prices collapsed from $110 per barrel in June 2014 to $40 by January 2016, a 64% collapse, and suddenly Venezuela's oil revenue fell from $90 billion to $40 billion per year, creating a $50 billion annual deficit, and Maduro faced a choice: cut spending by $50 billion, which would mean eliminating the social programs and government jobs that kept him in power, or print money to cover the deficit, and he chose to print, and this decision destroyed the currency and the economy. Here's exactly what happened when Venezuela started printing money to cover its deficit, and the timeline shows how hyperinflation accelerates in a predictable pattern that has repeated throughout history. In 2014, when oil revenue collapsed, the Venezuelan central bank, which is controlled by the president, began creating bolivars electronically to finance the government deficit. This is the same mechanism the US Federal Reserve uses when it buys government bonds with newly created money, except Venezuela did it on a much larger scale, and in 2014 the money supply measured as M2 increased by 48% in 1 year, meaning the central bank created 48% more bolivars, and basic economics says that if you increase the supply of anything, its value decreases. so increasing the money supply by 48%, decreased the value of each bolivar, and prices started rising. Inflation in 2014 was 62% officially, meaning prices doubled in less than 2 years. And this created a vicious cycle. When prices rise, the government needs more money to pay for the same programs, so it prints more money, which causes more inflation, which requires more printing, and this cycle accelerated every year. In 2015, the central bank printed even more money and inflation reached 122%. In 2016, inflation hit 255%, and at this point the economy was clearly in crisis. People were lining up for hours to buy basic goods, supermarket shelves were empty because producers couldn't keep up with rising costs, and the government's response was not to stop printing money, but to print more and implement price controls, making it illegal for stores to raise prices above government-set levels. And this made the crisis worse, because when the legal price is below the cost of production, producers stopped producing, and shortages became severe, and people started fleeing the country. Let me show you the exact numbers of how much money Venezuela printed, and how this directly caused the inflation, because the correlation between money printing and inflation is so precise, it proves causation, not just correlation. In 2013, before the crisis, Venezuela's M2 money supply was approximately 500 billion bolivars. By 2018, just 5 years later, the M2 money supply was 1.8 quadrillion bolivars. That's 1,800 trillion, which is an increase of 360,000%. The central bank created 3,600 times more bolivars in 5 years, and when you increase the supply of currency by 3,600 times, each unit becomes worth 3,600 times less, and this is exactly what happened. In 2013, $1 equaled 6.3 bolivars at the official rate. By 2018, $1 equaled 600,000 bolivars at the black market rate, which reflected reality, meaning the bolivar lost 99.999% of its value against the dollar in 5 years, and domestically, prices rose even faster. The price of a cup of coffee in Caracas went from 8 bolivars in 2013 to 2 million bolivars in 2018, a 25 million% increase. And these aren't estimates. These are documented prices tracked by Bloomberg's Café con Leche Index, which measured the price of coffee daily as a real-time inflation indicator. And by mid-2018, inflation was so severe that prices were doubling every 19 days. Economists call this hyperinflation, which is technically defined as 50% monthly inflation, and Venezuela's peak monthly inflation rate was 81,000% in July 2018, according to Steve Hanke's Troubled Currencies project at Johns Hopkins University, which translates to an annualized rate of 1,698,488%, the 23rd worst hyperinflation in recorded history. What would you do if you woke up tomorrow and discovered that your savings account, which had $10,000 yesterday, now buys only enough to purchase one loaf of bread? That your salary, which was deposited this morning, will be worth half as much by tomorrow, and that the currency your government issues is becoming worthless so fast that stores change prices multiple times per day and refuse to accept it, preferring to barter or use foreign currency? This is exactly what happened to Venezuelans, and the stories of how ordinary people survived reveal the human cost of government money printing that economic statistics can't capture. If you're starting to understand that Venezuela's hyperinflation was caused by a simple mechanism, the government printed unlimited money to cover spending it couldn't afford, and this money printing destroyed the currency's value through the basic economic law of supply and demand, and that this wasn't about socialism versus capitalism or US sanctions or oil dependence, but about monetary policy, specifically the choice to print fiat currency rather than maintain fiscal discipline. Then stay with me, because what comes next will show you how Venezuelans adapted to hyperinflation, why the government removed 14 zeros from the currency through 3 redenominations, how 7 million people fled the country, creating the largest migration crisis in Latin American history, and why Venezuela's collapse is a warning for the United States and every country that prints money to cover deficits. Subscribe now, because very few channels will explain hyperinflation with this level of detail and show you that what happened in Venezuela is not unique, but follows the exact pattern of every hyperinflation in history, from Weimar Germany to Zimbabwe. And understanding this pattern is essential because the United States Federal Reserve has printed $9 trillion since 2008, using the same mechanism Venezuela used. And while US inflation hasn't reached Venezuelan levels yet, the direction is identical and the endpoint is predictable. Here's how ordinary Venezuelans survived when their currency became worthless, and these survival strategies reveal that when government money fails, people spontaneously create alternatives. By 2017, when inflation was accelerating rapidly, Venezuelans stopped using bolivars for savings and increasingly for transactions. Instead, they used three alternatives: US dollars, which were illegal to own officially but widely used on the black market; Colombian pesos, which crossed the border; and cryptocurrency, especially Bitcoin, which saw massive adoption in Venezuela because it couldn't be printed by the government and held value across borders. Street vendors started pricing goods in dollars and accepting payment in bolivars at the daily black market exchange rate. So a vendor might say a bottle of water costs $1, but if you pay in bolivars, it's 600,000 today, and tomorrow it might be 700,000 as the bolivar depreciated overnight. This is called dollarization, when a country's citizens abandon the official currency and use foreign currency instead. And it happens in every hyperinflation. People aren't stupid. When their government destroys the currency, they stop using it. Grocery stores began weighing cash instead of counting it because counting millions of bolivars for a single transaction took too long. Photos from 2018 show store clerks with scales weighing stacks of bills like produce, and people carried cash in plastic bags or wheelbarrows because a day's worth of groceries required millions of bolivars in physical notes that weighed several pounds. Many Venezuelans stopped working traditional jobs because by the time they received their salary and went to spend it, inflation had destroyed its value. A salary paid on the first of the month might buy a month's worth of food on the day it's paid. But by the 15th, when you need to buy more food, that same money buys only a week's worth, and by the 30th, it buys one day's worth. So working for bolivars became pointless, and people turned to informal economy, trading services for food, migrating to other countries to send remittances back in dollars, or engaging in black market currency trading. Here's why the Venezuelan government redenominated the currency 3 times, removing a total of 14 zeros, and why this cosmetic change didn't stop hyperinflation, because it didn't address the root cause. When inflation reaches extreme levels, the currency units become so large they're unmanageable, prices in the millions or billions, and this creates practical problems for commerce. Cash registers can't display enough digits, bank computer systems overflow, and psychologically people lose faith when they see absurd numbers. So governments implement redenomination, which means creating a new currency by removing zeros from the old currency. It's purely cosmetic. If you had 1 million old bolivars and the government removes 5 zeros, you now have 10 new bolivars. Your purchasing power doesn't change. It's like saying $1 now equals 100 cents. So we'll remove 2 zeros and call $1 1 penny. Nothing real changes. Venezuela redenominated 3 times. In August 2008, Chavez removed 3 zeros. 1,000 bolivars became 1 bolivar fuerte, meaning strong bolivar. In August 2018, Maduro removed 5 zeros. 100,000 bolivar fuerte became 1 bolivar soberano, meaning sovereign bolivar. And in October 2021, Maduro removed 6 more zeros. 1 million bolivar soberano became 1 digital bolivar, and if you add these up, 3 plus 5 plus 6 equals 14 zeros removed total, meaning 100 trillion original bolivars from 2007 equals 1 bolivar today, and yet the currency is still worthless. Inflation continued after each redenomination because redenomination doesn't stop money printing. The central bank kept creating new bolivars to cover deficits, and inflation continued. The only thing that stops hyperinflation is stopping the money printing, and Venezuela didn't stop until the currency was completely destroyed and people abandoned it for dollars. Let me show you the human cost of Venezuela's hyperinflation in numbers that reveal this wasn't just an economic crisis, but a humanitarian catastrophe. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, over 7.1 million Venezuelans have fled the country since 2014. That's 25% of the population. making it the largest displacement crisis in Latin American history and one of the largest refugee crises globally comparable to Syria and Ukraine. And these people fled not because of war, but because of economic collapse caused by money printing. They couldn't afford food, couldn't find work that paid enough to survive, and saw no future. Inside Venezuela, poverty rates exploded. According to a 2021 survey by Hanke, 96.2% of Venezuelans lived below the poverty line, compared to 48% in 2014 before the crisis, meaning the middle class was essentially eliminated. People who had savings, owned homes, and lived comfortably saw their wealth evaporate as the currency collapsed, and even professionals like doctors and teachers earned salaries equivalent to $5 per month, which couldn't buy basic necessities. The health crisis was severe. Infant mortality increased 140% from 2008 to 2016. According to government data that was later suppressed, maternal mortality increased 65%, and hospitals lacked basic medicines and supplies because the bolivar was worthless for importing goods, and the government had no dollars. Photos from Venezuelan hospitals show surgery rooms with no lights, patients on floors, and doctors performing procedures with no anesthesia. Malnutrition became widespread. A study published in The Lancet found that between 2017 and 2019, Venezuelans lost an average of 11 kilograms of body weight, 24 pounds, due to food scarcity and inability to afford food. This is called the Maduro diet, a dark joke about government-induced starvation, and there were documented cases of people eating garbage, zoo animals being killed for meat, and widespread child malnutrition. All of this human suffering traces directly to one cause. The government printed money to cover spending, destroyed the currency, and when the currency became worthless, imports stopped, production collapsed, and people starved, and the government's response was to print more money and blame sanctions, rather than stop printing and fix the root cause. Here are the arguments defenders make for why Venezuela's hyperinflation was caused by US sanctions or oil dependence or socialism rather than money printing, and why every argument fails when you examine the timeline and the data. They claim US sanctions destroyed Venezuela's economy, but the timeline doesn't match. US sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector began in January 2019 under Trump, but hyperinflation started in 2016 and peaked in July 2018 before the oil sanctions existed. Earlier sanctions targeted individuals, not the economy, so sanctions can't be the cause of hyperinflation that preceded them. Sanctions made things worse after 2019 but didn't cause the initial collapse. They claim Venezuela's dependence on oil revenue made it vulnerable to oil price crashes, and this is partially true. Venezuela was dependent on oil, but so is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Norway, and these countries didn't experience hyperinflation when oil prices fell. They cut spending, used sovereign wealth funds, or borrowed. They didn't print unlimited money, so oil dependence explains the fiscal crisis, but doesn't explain the monetary response. Printing money was a choice. They claim socialism caused the collapse through state ownership and price controls, but other socialist countries like Cuba or Vietnam didn't have hyperinflation because they didn't print unlimited money. And capitalist countries like Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany did have hyperinflation because they printed unlimited money. So the political system isn't the cause. Monetary policy is. You can have socialism with sound money or capitalism with unsound money. The key variable is money printing, not ideology. They claim Maduro was incompetent or corrupt, and this may be true, but hyperinflation doesn't require incompetence. It requires printing money to cover deficits, which is exactly what competent governments do when they face fiscal crises and don't want to cut spending. The US Fed did it in 2008. Japan has been doing it for 30 years. The ECB does it. The difference is degree, not kind. Venezuela printed more, so it got hyperinflation faster. But the mechanism is identical. Here's the economic law that explains Venezuela and every hyperinflation in history, and why this law is as reliable as gravity. The quantity theory of money states that the price level in an economy is proportional to the money supply. The equation is MV equals PQ, where M is money supply, V is velocity, how fast money circulates, P is price level, and Q is quantity of goods produced, And if you increase M, the money supply, while Q, the quantity of goods, stays the same or decreases, then P, the price level, must increase proportionally. This is not theory, this is accounting identity. It must be true by definition. In Venezuela's case, M, the money supply, increased 3,600 times from 2013 to 2018, while Q, the quantity of goods produced, decreased because of economic crisis. Factories closed, producers fled, imports stopped, so you had vastly more money chasing vastly fewer goods, and P, the price level, exploded. This is hyperinflation, and it happens every time a government prints unlimited money while production collapses. The pattern is identical in Weimar Germany 1923, Hungary 1946, Zimbabwe 2008, and Venezuela 2018. The details differ, but the mechanism is the same. Government prints money to cover deficits, money supply explodes, currency value collapses, prices skyrocket, people abandon the currency, and the government either stops printing and stabilizes or continues printing until complete destruction. Venezuela continued until complete destruction. The bolivar today is essentially worthless. Most transactions use dollars. The government implicitly accepts this dollarization because it has no choice. You can't force people to use money they don't trust. And this is the ultimate lesson. Government control of money is an illusion. If the government destroys the currency, people will find alternatives, and no amount of laws or threats can prevent this. Let me show you how Venezuela's hyperinflation compares to other famous hyperinflations in history and where it ranks. The Hanke hyperinflation table, compiled by Steve Hanke at Johns Hopkins, documents 58 hyperinflations since the French Revolution, and Venezuela ranks 23rd by peak monthly inflation rate. Here are the top 5. Number 1 is Hungary in July 1946, with peak daily inflation of 207%, which translates to quadrillions of percent annually. The Hungarian pengo became so worthless, the government issued a 100 quintillion pengo note. Number 2 is Zimbabwe in November 2008, with estimated peak monthly inflation of 7.96 times 10 to the 10th percent or 79.6 billion percent monthly. The Zimbabwe dollar was abandoned entirely. Number 3 is Yugoslavia in January 1994, with 313 million percent monthly inflation. Number 4 is Germany in October 1923, the famous Weimar hyperinflation, with 29,500% monthly inflation, where people used wheelbarrows of marks to buy bread. And number 5 is Greece in October 1944, during World War II, with 13,800% monthly. And Venezuela at number 23 had peak monthly inflation of 81,000% in July 2018, which is catastrophic but not historically unique. And what's notable is that all 58 hyperinflations on this list have the same cause: governments printing money to finance spending. Sometimes it's war spending like Weimar or Greece, sometimes it's socialist programs like Venezuela, sometimes it's corruption like Zimbabwe, but the mechanism is always the same: print money, destroy currency, hyperinflation results, and the lesson is universal. Fiat currency that can be printed without limit will eventually be printed without limit, and when that happens, it becomes worthless. Here's why Venezuela's collapse is a warning for the United States, and why the Federal Reserve's money printing since 2008 is following the same pattern, just at a slower speed. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created approximately $9 trillion through quantitative easing. This is the same mechanism Venezuela used. The central bank creates money electronically and uses it to buy government bonds or other assets, and this increases the money supply. M2 in the United States has increased from 8 trillion in 2008 to 21 trillion today. That's a 163% increase. And while this isn't 3,600 times like Venezuela, it's still massive monetary expansion, and it has caused inflation. Official CPI shows the dollar lost about 35% of its purchasing power since 2008. But if you use the original CPI methodology before the government changed the calculation to understate inflation, real inflation is much higher, closer to 100%, meaning prices doubled, and this matches lived experience. Housing prices doubled or tripled, healthcare costs doubled, education costs tripled. The things people actually need became vastly more expensive, while the official CPI claims only 35% inflation because it doesn't properly weight housing and uses hedonic adjustments and substitution that hide real price increases. The United States hasn't experienced hyperinflation yet because the dollar is the world reserve currency, so there's artificial demand. And because the economy is still productive, so the quantity of goods hasn't collapsed like Venezuela, but the trajectory is identical. The government runs massive deficits. Federal debt is 36 trillion and growing. There's no political will to cut spending or raise taxes enough to balance the budget. So the deficit is financed by the Fed buying bonds with printed money. This is exactly what Venezuela did. The only difference is scale and speed. The US does it at 3 to 5% inflation per year instead of 3,000%, but compounded over decades, the result is the same. Dollar lost 98% of value since 1971, and it continues losing value. And there's no mechanism to stop it because stopping money printing would require either massive spending cuts or tax increases that are politically impossible. So the printing continues, and every dollar you save loses value every year. And this is guaranteed to continue until either the system reforms, which seems unlikely, or the dollar suffers a crisis of confidence like the bolivar. And when that happens, Americans will do what Venezuelans did, abandon the dollar and use alternatives, gold, Bitcoin, foreign currencies, barter. Because when the government destroys money, people protect themselves. Here's how to protect yourself from the slow-motion hyperinflation that's happening in the United States and every country that prints fiat money. Because understanding Venezuela's collapse is useless unless you apply the lesson. The key insight from Venezuela is that holding cash in a currency that's being printed is guaranteed to make you poorer. Venezuelans who held bolivars lost everything. Venezuelans who held dollars or gold preserved wealth. So the strategy is clear: minimize cash holdings and maximize hard assets. Hard assets are things that can't be printed and have intrinsic value or limited supply. The best examples are gold and silver, which have been money for 5,000 years and can't be created by governments. Since 2013, when Venezuela's crisis began, gold increased from $1,200 per ounce to $2,700 today, a 125% gain, meaning if a Venezuelan bought gold in 2013, they'd have preserved and grown wealth, while holding bolivars destroyed wealth completely. Real estate is another hard asset if you can afford it. Property values tend to track inflation because land and structures have real value, though real estate requires large capital and has carrying costs like property taxes. Productive assets, like stocks in profitable companies, can preserve value because companies can raise prices to match inflation. Though stock markets have risk and volatility, the S&P 500 has returned about 10% annually since 1950, which beats inflation but requires riding out crashes. Cryptocurrency, especially Bitcoin, is a new option that Venezuelans widely adopted. Bitcoin has a fixed supply cap of 21 million coins, so it can't be inflated like fiat currency, and while it's volatile, its long-term trend is appreciation against fiat currencies. Bitcoin went from $300 in 2013 to $47,000 today, massively outperforming inflation, though again with extreme volatility. The worst thing to hold is cash and bonds denominated in fiat currency. A savings account earning 1% while inflation is 5% real makes you lose 4% per year in purchasing power. And bonds are even worse because you're lending money that will be repaid in devalued currency. The optimal strategy is to hold only minimal cash for immediate expenses, maybe 3 to 6 months of living costs, and invest everything else in hard assets that preserve value. This is what wealthy people and institutions do. They don't hold cash, they hold assets. And this is why the rich get richer during inflation while wage earners get poorer. The rich hold assets that appreciate while workers hold dollars that depreciate. Understanding this is the first step to protecting yourself. Now you understand exactly how Venezuela's government printed 1,698,000% inflation by creating money to cover deficits. The central bank increased the money supply from 500 billion bolivars in 2013 to 1.8 quadrillion bolivars in 2018, a 3,600-fold increase that destroyed the currency's value. And you understand that this hyperinflation followed the exact pattern of every hyperinflation in history, Government faces fiscal crisis, prints money instead of cutting spending. Money supply explodes, prices rise, government prints more, creating a death spiral, and currency becomes worthless. And you understand that Venezuela's collapse wasn't caused by socialism or sanctions or oil dependence, but by the simple economic law that printing unlimited money destroys currency value through supply and demand, and this law works the same in every country and every political system. And you understand that 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, 96% fell into poverty, people lost an average of £24 due to food scarcity, and the currency was redenominated 3 times, removing 14 zeros total, yet remained worthless because redenomination doesn't stop inflation. Only stopping the printing stops inflation. And you understand that Venezuela's crisis is a warning for the United States, where the Federal Reserve has printed $9 trillion since 2008. And the dollar has lost 98% of its value since 1971, and while US inflation is slower than Venezuela's, the mechanism is identical, and the trajectory is the same. Governments print money to cover deficits, currency loses value, and there's no way to stop it under the current system, because stopping requires fiscal discipline that's politically impossible. If this explanation of how Venezuela's money printing destroyed its currency and created 1,000,000% inflation has made you understand that fiat currency is a system designed to transfer wealth from savers to governments and banks who create money, that hyperinflation is the inevitable endpoint of unlimited money printing, whether it happens fast like Venezuela or slow like the United States, and that the only protection is holding assets that governments can't print like gold and real property. Then you need to see what we reveal next, because Venezuela is just one example of a pattern that repeats throughout history. Subscribe now and prepare to discover how the Weimar Republic printed unlimited marks in the 1920s and destroyed Germany's currency, creating wheelbarrows of worthless cash, how Zimbabwe printed trillions of Zimbabwe dollars in the 2000s and created $100 trillion notes that couldn't buy bread, how the United States printed $9 trillion through quantitative easing and gave it to Wall Street while you got nothing, how Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and destroyed your savings through permanent inflation, and how FDR confiscated gold in 1933 and threatened 10 years prison for ownership to remove the one constraint on money printing. Because once you understand that every fiat currency in history has eventually been printed into worthlessness, and that governments always choose printing over fiscal discipline because printing is easy and cutting spending is hard, you'll understand why holding cash guarantees you'll get poorer, why inflation never stops under fiat systems, why gold has held value for 5,000 years while every paper currency has failed, why Venezuela's collapse from wealth to poverty in 5 years is your future if you trust government money, and why the only way to protect yourself is to do what Venezuelans did: abandon the government currency before it's worthless and hold assets that can't be printed, because the collapse that destroyed Venezuela is happening everywhere. It's just happening slower, but the destination is the same: worthless currency, destroyed savings, and government theft through inflation that continues until people refuse to accept the money anymore.